I have filament. I have some resin. Filament resin. Yeah, good luck getting that song out of your head now. Today I'll try to combine some of the advantages from filament printing, that is cheap, fast, and can do large prints, with the surface finish of an actual SLA resin. Let's try it out. Just a quick note, we're working with resin today. Make sure you're also wearing gloves and the appropriate safety gear. I mean, not while you're watching this video, but if you decide to try this out for yourself. So, before I even started with the actual experiment, I did a quick test to see whether it was actually worth making a whole video on resin finishing, and oh boy, did this have promise. There were two small issues with this trial where I just literally dunked the part into the resin vat on the SL1, and that's that there's this massive elephant foot from where the resin piled up on the bottom of my container, and obviously this is neither practical nor pretty, but if you look at the branch structure up here, many of the branches also have fused into one big blob. I think that's because the resin itself is actually quite thick and has a fairly high surface tension, so it likes to round out inside edges. You can see that here as well. I did give it a quick spray of gray primer just to show the actual surface of the part, and the actual effect I was looking for, that is hiding the layer lines, that is working out really well. So, to get started on this first part, what I did was to thread a pair of screws into the bolt holes on the part, and then I stuck it onto the container using a pair of small magnets. So now we have a gap where hopefully the resin can just drip off and not leave that big foot anymore. On this first trial, I just had way too much resin on the part that I then had to get off somehow. So this time I brushed on some resin, tried to get it into all the nooks and crannies, but because this was still quite a layer that I had just put on, I then used a hot air reflow station, which is basically a precise adjustable heat gun, and just lightly heated up and basically blew off as much of the resin as I could. When resin is warm, it gets a lot more liquid, and all the small bubbles that the brush left also instantly pop. The problem is that the lowest this station goes is 100 degrees Celsius, so if I left that on my part for too long, it would just melt the plastic itself. So I had to be pretty fast with moving it across. Once I was happy with that coat, I tried to get as much of the resin to drip off and chucked it into the CW1 to harden the coat. That's the nice thing with UV resins. You can work it as long as you want, but it doesn't dry by itself. And once you're happy with how it looks, you just pop it under some UV light and it hardens pretty quickly. As it turns out, the heated resin actually gets pretty liquid and leaves layer lines fairly well visible. So I added 2 more coats on top and always popped it back into the CW1 for a cure cycle between coats. What I'm definitely still seeing is that we're losing quite a few details. Some of these branches are starting to disappear and inside corners are getting rounded out quite a lot. With the hot air reflow station, it's heating up the already thin layers at the surface pretty quickly, but the pools on inside corners and the areas around details just have more mass and more of the base part contacting it, so they're taking longer to heat up and then become liquid. So open surfaces like these had most of the resin running off, but on the inside corners it still accumulated quite a lot. When I went to clean up the first part, I accidentally dripped some of the isopropanol into my resin container, and that gave me the idea to actually thin down the resin before applying it. With just a thin layer of diluted resin, the solvent should evaporate off fairly quickly, and if not, I can always help it along with the drying feature of the CW1 or some warm air. But the extra runniness at the start should be enough, that's this part, to get it out of inside corners quickly. Plus, we have the exact inverse of what we just saw with heat, because inside corners still have less surface area and more mass, proportionally to each other, in that resin pool. The solvent should actually evaporate more slowly in corners and keep the resin runny for longer there. I started out with a mix of roughly 2 parts of resin and 1 part of solvent, and this immediately made the resin a lot thinner. I mean, as expected. In fact, I could straight up pour the mix over my part, and all I had to do was to make sure it got into all the creases, and I could then have it drip off into my container. A few more coats and cure cycles here too, and actually I do really like how this turned out. It's covering up all the layer lines, but still retains a lot of the details. Also, this was just so much easier to apply. Just pour it over or brush it on as thick as you want, and you can then just let the excess drip off. And the surface finish is actually better than when I was just using pure resin right here. If you look closely, you can still see some wrinkles here and there, but I think these come from not having one of the underlying layers of resin fully totally cured yet before applying the next one. And since the thinned down resin worked so well, why not just keep going? This time I mixed up more of a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 mix, that is 2 parts solvent and 1 part resin. This stuff is super runny, definitely much closer to pure isopropanol than to resin, and I did the same thing. Pour it over, drip it off, cure it. It's weird because the surface almost instantly turns super smooth and glossy on the first coat, even though this mix is a lot thinner now. One more thing that we can see with the thinned down resin is that the areas where there was more resin pooled up actually turned out sort of cloudy white. That's probably because it didn't let the IPA evaporate enough before hitting it with UV light to cure it. And also after a few days you can actually see this kind of lifting off from the PLA, so yeah, I should have definitely let the IPA evaporate more. My favorite one out of these three is the one that's just been lightly thinned down. But I did enjoy how easy it was to apply the super thinned down one. It's really about time. If you use thinned down resin, you do need to factor in the drying time between coats on top of the curing time itself. If you're finishing several parts at the same time in coat one while the other one is drying and curing, that's totally fine. But if it's just one single part that you're doing, it makes for quite a bit of awkward standing around because obviously you're wearing contaminated gloves and probably don't want to take them off and throw them out between coats. But it's still a bit too long just to stand there not being able to touch anything and waiting for the resin to cure. Still, it is a lot quicker than either spraying and sanding a finish or mixing up a 2-part resin, applying it and waiting for that to cure. So these parts actually worked out incredibly well. All three versions, they all have their ups and downs depending on how you do it. But since this worked out so well, why not try something a bit bigger? This is an alien egg that I printed on the Raptor 2.0 using the E3D Super Volcano with really thick layers, and you can definitely still see them. There's also holes in the surface because I didn't have the settings all tuned in, and with a nozzle that big and a layer height that tall, it's just not going to be perfect. So let's try if we can finish this part with resin, make it waterproof because this is supposed to be a planting pot, and obviously this doesn't fit in the CW1 anymore. So to harden resin outside of a curing station, you can either use a little UV flashlight like that, but that just takes forever to do because it doesn't have a lot of power. Or you can do what I did. I grabbed myself one of these little driverless 50-watt LED chips, and these are incredibly bright. But if you run these, make sure you have a case around them because there's open mains voltage on this PCB. Look at this. This is crazy bright. Wow. And because this thing is so incredibly bright, you should probably also put on some eye protection. I know this looks incredibly stupid, especially when you're already wearing glasses, but better look stupid than not being able to see stupid anymore, right? I'm using Wanhao resin for this one because I'm thinking I'll need quite a bit of it, and this Wanhao stuff actually doesn't harden properly when I use it in a printer. So why not use it up in an experiment like this? This is supposed to be yellow resin, but I think the pigments have just all settled into a crust at the bottom of the container by now. So the resin looks more like, I don't know, liquid snot or something. This is pretty much the perfect consistency for the alien egg. I want this to look slimy and wet and disgusting, and a thick layer of resin is absolutely going to help with that. So let's glob some of this stuff on. I started with the top petals, I guess. Those still had some holes in them from the print, and the resin covered most of them instantly. A quick flash of UV light and what's that smoke? Turns out if you harden the resin too quickly, it actually overheats and cooks itself. And it looks like it also detached from the print just a bit. But it did harden almost instantly. I went ahead and did about 2 coats on the entire thing. Some areas got a bit more, some a bit less. It's just hard to cover everything evenly in basically clear resin, especially when it's a part this big. But if you look at how it turned out, wow, this surface is really smooth, and with the thicker high gloss resin on it, it really does look like it's covered in slime. Which actually it was. The one-how resin still didn't cure properly, so it was left with an oily layer on top. Either that's totally uncured resin or it's some component of the resin accumulating on the surface. Either way, it's not great, so I gave the entire thing a wash in IPA, which took off most of the sticky layer, at least enough to apply the final surface finish on top. That's going to be a gloss coat. I thought about giving it an opaque coat first, but that would lose that depth of the resin layer and just give it a flat, even color. So just a clear coat, let's do that right now, and then let's compare my results to what it would look like if I just used the resin as intended and, you know, just printed these parts directly from resin in an SLA printer. So that's what that looks like. Obviously the resin print still has a lot more detail. I printed this one at 0.035mm layer height. That took a while to finish, but it doesn't quite have the same glossy surface. In fact, this is completely matte versus the super glossy finish that we got from the FDM plus resin finish print. I guess you could still spray paint the resin print and get that, but unless you have a crazy massive resin printer, you're not going to get something, you know, this size. These brackets are normally over 3 times this size, and I think at that scale, losing a bit of detail from the resin finishing process isn't much of a problem at all, unless you've got a part that does some mechanical job. But with resin coating, you can always mask off surfaces that need to mate with other parts. I definitely like this resin coating approach a lot, and I think this is finally a good and quick and cheap way to get rid of print layers. I've experimented before with nitrous filler, spray filler, 2-component bog. In fact, I've got some parts that I did with that here. And these parts do look smooth and nice and soft and all that, but they just took forever to finish. This took like 5 coats to get it this far. So yeah, this process is by far the least effort, and in comparison, you know, with finishing a part the traditional way, it isn't even that messy. And if you still want to do more to these parts, unlike pure PLA, you know, a resin and a resin coat actually sands pretty well. Let me know if you try this, and if you have any tips to share, please leave them in the comments below. And a big thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. You're really close to 2 to the power of 18 subscribers, so click that button, choose your notification level, and I will see you in the next one.